So when we talk about who is in charge of fiscal policy, this is a different answer than when you start talking about monetary policy. A lot of times students say the government is in charge of economic policy. But the government involves a lot of different people. When you talk about monetary policy, you'll see that the Federal Reserve is not the same as the people in charge. They're not elected. They're not in charge of fiscal policy. The president has no control over the dollar. But the president of the U.S. does have control over fiscal policy. So generally speaking, we talk about elected officials. The president and Congress. And they pass bills just like they pass bills for anything else the government does. And because this is the United States and politicians don't always get along, it might not be very easy for one politician to promote spending and to get the other side to agree. And for that reason, this 2009 stimulus is probably the last stimulus we'd see. That anything else the president might propose will get voted down in Congress, and anything Congress approved might get vetoed by the president. And so this requires a lot of political cooperation. And like I mentioned, the tools of what you can do in fiscal policy is, generally speaking, government spending and taxes. One problem that we mentioned before is that it's only going to earn you votes if you spend more money on things people like. It's only going to earn you more votes if you cut taxes. This is basically one direction. And so this tool only leads to what's called an expansionary policy. And so fiscal policy in the U.S. tends to only be expansionary to fight recessions. The alternative is called contractionary. But no politician does this anymore, unless there's some dire reason. And the reason people usually give is to pay off the debt. That the deficits that result are too big of a problem. So those are kind of a reason why we don't use fiscal policy as much and why we do use monetary policy. All right? And so the last thing that we'll get into is what problems result because of fiscal policy. As I mentioned, debt or deficits are huge. Right? The most people will not want to overspend, and you see policymakers in the U.S. doing that. Another problem that I mentioned before is that it requires cooperation. And then the final problem is that it is slow. Policy takes a long time to work, especially if you have to convene Congress and get people on your side. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we talk about what are called time lags. That if you are facing a bad economic situation, you might find out that it's not, the situation is over before you can actually get around to fix it. So that's the idea, that when we talk about the government being in charge, it's actually political actors, not the banking system. And they actually do political things that require them to work together. And it does involve all the things that it takes to pass a law, which is very slow compared to how fast the economy moves.